Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org. Want to watch more from Acton? Visit ondemand.acton.org. There you will find hundreds of lectures, conferences, and Acton events through the years. They're categorized, free, and more content is regularly added.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Nathan Mech, Manager of the Collins Center for Abrahamic Heritage at the Acton Institute. We'll be discussing the history and work of the Collins Center, what makes up the Abrahamic Heritage, and the challenges and opportunities that Interfaith Dialogue presents. Nathan, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's great to be here. I'm a little disappointed that you didn't have that inflatable airman you had at the first video podcast, the car dealership figurine.
He is at my desk. I can fire him up when I write the show notes. So the
I thought I warranted
know.
one of those celebrations, but it's okay.
He is
honored to be here.
He's with us in spirit. When we're talking about a big topic like interfaith dialogue, I think it's good to start small and grounded. And the small and grounded way to start, I think, is to talk about sort of the Collins Center, why it was established here. A little bit of the story of what the thinking was behind its founding, how it was founded, and then, we work our way out from the larger issues that the Collins Center was sort of constructed and designed to contribute to.
I think that's a great way to start the conversation. Mm-hmm. So if you've spoken to either of the Acton Institute's co-founders, or if you've read the founding documents of the Acton Institute, in particular the 1990 Statement of Purpose of the Acton Institute, you'll see that it was always explicitly part of Acton Institute's mission to engage a multi-religious audience with our work. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm Christian. You're Christian. The two co-founders of Acton Institute are both Christian. Mm-hmm. But if we want to engage the world with our vision for a free and virtuous society, we have to get out of our Christian silos at some point. Mm-hmm. So the Collins Center was this intentional step to realize that founding vision of the Acton Institute and reach out to the Muslim world with Acton Institute's principles, reach a Jewish audience. So in particular, those Abrahamic faiths. Mm-hmm. The Collins Center was formally launched in 2022. So I came to Acton Institute 8 years ago in 2017, in an executive role where I was sort of the chief of staff to the two co-founders of Acton. Mm-hmm. And I heard this founding vision from them and really caught that, lit a spark in me. I caught that vision and I started to try to develop some of these programs to diversify the audiences of Acton's work. We signed on contract early in my time at Acton Mustafa Akyol, who's been absolutely instrumental in helping Acton's outreach to a Muslim audience. And then this work eventually led to a very generous gift from Gilbert Collins, from a friend in California, who enabled the launching of this new department. So I completed the strategic plan and finalized our mission statement, that sort of thing, 2022. And since then, we've been a new department at the Acton Institute.
Yeah. So before that, folks like Mustafa had a longstanding relationship with the Acton Institute, had spoken at Acton University for many years. We had a number of Jewish scholars publish monographs with us. We had Isaac Lifshitz published a monograph with us, and then the Sowers published a monograph with us. So we had some publications, we had some individual lectures or programming, but there wasn't any dedicated institutional center to this particular sort of work. Where did you see the upside of having sort of an institutional home within the Acton Institute for this sort of work, rather than just inviting, let's say, Muslim speakers, Jewish speakers, trying to network with organizations in the Jewish world, in the Muslim world? What's the particular selling point of having a center do this as opposed to it just being, one-off things?
Sure. So Acton Institute is 35 years old now, and after over 30 years of our existence, and we weren't fully taking advantage of that essential part of our mission that we wanted to be doing more of. I think we realized that we needed to have a dedicated staff and dedicated department to focusing on expanding these outreach areas. Because though it was always a goal, always something like you pointed out, we were doing in these various ways, there was a lot of meat on the bone.
Yeah.
There's just a lot more we could be doing. And what better way to do it than to have this formal initiative aimed at that?
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. So what are some of the ongoing initiatives of the Collins Center now that this sort of work has a sort of institutional home within the institution? What are some of the initiatives that you've helped spearhead to bring sort of more unique, tailored programming, publications, and outreach to folks in the Jewish and Muslim world?
Yeah. So Acton Institute's programs in general fall into three buckets. There's publications and research. There's media, so that includes things like this podcast, our documentary films. And then there's conferences and events. Collins Center is doing all three of those things, just like the broader Acton Institute is.
Yeah.
So, for example, at our flagship conference, Acton University, that happens the third week of June each year, that is possibly the most internationally diverse think tank conference in the world. So it's a perfect opportunity to bring together not only people from over 80 different countries, but people from many different faiths to engage in encounters with people who have different faiths and to discuss how we can collaborate around this vision Acton has for a free and virtuous society. So that's one thing. We do lots of programming around Acton University. The Collins Center also has our own conferences around the world. We had one in Madrid in 2022. We've had conferences in Rome, and then this year we've had conferences different spots in the UK. And then we have a debate series I'm excited about. So
yeah. And we will be synchronizing the release of this podcast as sort of part of a promotional of the latest iteration of that debate series.
Fantastic.
So could you tell us a little bit about that series, actually past installments of that series, and what folks can look forward to with the new series?
Yeah, so debates are an exciting way to display two different viewpoints and get a little bit of a contrast. So the audience can make up their own mind. But when we think of debates at the Acton Institute, the goal is really civil dialogue.
Yeah.
It's not an antagonistic setting. It's really trying to demonstrate how two people who might not agree on everything can discuss their ideas in a respectful way. I think that's very needed in the world today.
Absolutely.
So last year we launched this debate series through the Collins Center. The first debate we did was between Mustafa Akyol, who's a part-time staff member of the Acton Institute, and Sheikh Yasser Qadi, who's a well-known Muslim intellectual in the United States. And they debated basically the separation of church and state, but from a Muslim perspective. And that debate generated over 100,000 views on Acton's page. I encourage our audience here to see it. And then it was reposted and ended up doubling that viewership across other people's platforms.
I was looking just the other day at YouTube at like some of our most viewed. This is like the sixth or seventh most viewed thing that Acton's done in and we've been on YouTube for 20 years. It's very impressive viewership.
Yeah, that was a cool project. And then we released a second debate that was the same question, but from a Christian perspective. That also generated I think it was in the top 2 or 3% of Acton's videos by views as well.
Yep. And that was Kevin Vallier and Sebastian Morello. Yeah. It was an excellent debate.
Yep, exactly. And then the next one, which I'm excited to announce, is going to be filmed in just a couple weeks. And that's going to be a debate between Carl Trueman and Vincent Munoz. And that's going to be on whether Christianity is compatible with liberalism, and in particular, liberalism in the classical political sense of that term.
Yep.
So I'm very excited to moderate that debate in a couple weeks.
That'll be very exciting. One of the things you pointed out, how Acton's had this commitment to engaging people of different religious backgrounds, looking through the world's great religions and finding, common threads, particularly around human liberty, dignity of the human person, all of these things that make up sort of Acton's core principles. They have resonance in multiple religious traditions. What is it in particular? The Collins Center is not just interfaith, though. It's particularly Abrahamic Heritage.
That's right.
And particularly concentrated on engaging folks in the Jewish and Muslim worlds. What is the Abrahamic heritage, and what is its sort of unique contribution in the world religions? Why does the Abrahamic heritage? Why do we think of that as a group? Is it merely historical, or is it because there's additional resonances between these faith traditions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism?
Great questions. So let's break down what Abrahamic heritage means. So first, heritage, of course, means tradition, what we've inherited from people who came before us. Yep. And then Abrahamic refers to the Abrahamic faiths. In particular, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are the three major ones. There's also minor Abrahamic faiths like Baha'i and the Druze. But as you pointed out, there's commonalities that these major Abrahamic faiths share. Of course, we all trace our lineage to the prophet Abraham. That's where the term comes from. Yep. But there's also commonalities, like we are monotheistic religions. And we share scriptures. Christians use the Jewish scriptures and then have the New Testament as well. Muslims also believe that the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospel were divinely inspired. And then believe the Quran was also divinely inspired. So not only the lineage, but some of the basic theological presuppositions and also the scriptures used by members of those Abrahamic faiths are shared. So this maybe could inspire the question, why name this center the Collins Center for Abrahamic Heritage? Of course, Collins is the namesake of the donor that's behind the center. Yep. But for Abrahamic Heritage, well, there's quite a lot that our society has inherited from these Abrahamic monotheisms. I'm speaking into a microphone right now. Of course, the carbon microphone was invented by a Jewish inventor. I'm drinking coffee. Coffee comes from the Arab world, Yemen, I think. Books, the printing press was invented by a Catholic thinker. Universities, hospitals, the scientific method. These major institutions in society all were largely influenced by members of the Abrahamic faiths. If I were to ask you, what date is this podcast going to air? Yeah. You might give me a year, right, that comes from the birth date of Jesus Christ. And we would look to the Gregorian calendar, which, of course, was influenced by Catholicism. And then if I asked you, what are you doing this weekend? What are your plans for this weekend, Dan? The reason we have weekends comes from the Jewish Sabbath originally. So many things, and you're wearing glasses, right? We can think a Muslim inventor back in, I think, the 12th century, Ibn al-Haytham, for laying the groundwork for optics theory that led to the invention of glasses. So much of what we have today was inherited from the Abrahamic faiths. But what really excites me, and at the Acton Institute, we don't just talk about inventions and stuff like that. That's not really our mission. We focus on foundational philosophical principles, and there's foundational philosophical principles from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that have changed the world, and that's what really excites me. So to go through a few examples in Judaism.
So let's take a minute here to talk about, okay, these three threads. So we've got a theological thread. We've got a theological thread that is most explicit in Abraham. There are, there's the original sort of in the Hebrew Bible, there is the original sort of Abraham story of the patriarchs. There is a retelling of that in the Quran that differs in important places, but also has resonances with other places. And Abraham is very important to the Apostle Paul's arguments that he makes in his epistles about what Christianity is and the importance of faith and these sorts of things. So there's that theological tradition, but there's also a sort of civilizational tradition where a lot of folks will talk about Western civilization. Well, Western civilization, North Africa is in the West. Like we talk about Augustine as part of the Western tradition, but then a lot of folks will look at Islam as something that's alien to the West. And I think that's a real big mistake. I mean, part of the reason is there's continuous dialogue and exchange and warfare and contact with the Islamic world and with medieval Christendom. Jews are in the mix in both worlds, often in precarious places in both worlds, but also making key sort of intellectual and cultural and commercial contributions to those worlds. So you have an argument that's on one hand theological. You've got another argument that is civilizational, maybe asking us to broaden our understanding of Western civilization a little bit from where a lot of folks typically think of Western civilization. And then there's this philosophical underpinning. And so let's go back to you and have you unpack that.
Yeah, great comments. So there are some philosophical contributions that the Abrahamic monotheisms made that I think are game changers. From Judaism would be the idea of universal human dignity. Now that's the first core principle of the Acton Institute, human dignity. And this becomes a foundation really for all of ethics. The idea that all people, simply in virtue of being made in the image of God, have this intrinsic, inalienable dignity that entitles them to certain rights. Now, the language of human rights was later developed in human history, but I think the groundwork was really laid within Judaism for this. And without that, it's hard to really build an ethical paradigm. So with Christianity, I think there's a number of foundational philosophical contributions you could point to. Just to give one, there's a distinction between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law that actually comes out of the New Testament. So Jesus presents kind of a radical rethinking of the law where it's not just the letter, the exact literal interpretation of what a law says, but you have to look at the intention, the spirit behind that law. And then St. Paul in his epistles formalizes that distinction when he says that the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. And our legal system today still uses that terminology, which was derived from the New Testament. And that's essential because I think if we only look at the letter of the law, we're doomed to have inflexible, unjust laws that don't meet the specific needs of people in different contexts and places and time. And then from Islam, one fascinating contribution is actually to capitalism. Benedict Kohler has a book called Early Islam and the Birth of Capitalism, has kind of a provocative thesis that capitalism saw its first instantiation in world history in 7th century Arabia under Muhammad. So if we look at Islamic history, one of the women who I think deserves a lot more discussion and conversations of the most influential women in world history is Muhammad's first wife, Khadija. Khadija was a venture capitalist, and she was one of the funders behind Muhammad's early business ventures as a merchant.
Yep.
Muhammad was himself a businessman. And Khadija was older than Muhammad, invested in his caravans, and then actually proposed to him to marry him. Later, she was a strong encouragement to him to pursue his prophetic mission. So without her, we might not have Islam. But Muhammad was someone with a lot of business sense. And so after he established a religion and a church, he also established a marketplace, and he set out rules for this marketplace. And if you look at the hadiths that describe some of these rules, it's fascinating. For example, he forbade tariffs, which is particularly interesting in 2025.
Yep.
Another example, there was price gouging happening in his community. People came to him and said, please fix the prices because the cost of our goods keeps going up and up. And he said that would be an injustice because prices are in the hands of God. And he forbade price setting. And that's a really strong injunction against price setting. So there's these fascinating free market precedents set in early Islam. Now, he also set up a market inspector to make sure there wasn't fraud or cheating occurring in the marketplace. But Benedict Kohler's argument is that capitalism came out of the Islamic world.
Yeah. We will include a link to that book in the show notes. This sounds fascinating. This is something that I know very little about, something that I know a little more about. And I wanted to ask about, now the Collins Center, there are very good reasons to talk about Abrahamic heritage for all the reasons we've talked about. There's these common theological threads that run through. There is this sort of civilizational dialogue that is part of the story of Christian civilization, Islamic civilization, and Jewish civilization. They have always existed together, developed together, influenced each other. And then there's these philosophical principles. There's this interesting part where Lord Acton talks about, when Lord Acton, in his History of Liberty and Antiquity, he starts his story with the Hebrews and goes forward. And he mentions sort of Greek and Roman contributions. He doesn't explicitly mention Islamic contributions, but I think you're absolutely right. Those are there. He does, in an offhanded remark, mention the first Buddhist king of India, Ashoka, as being a sort of pioneer of religious liberty. And he just sort of mentions that, and he's like, what I know and appreciate is this, primarily Western tradition, but he acknowledges there might be analogous traditions in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
How do you think about, the primary audience of the Collins Center are folks that share an Abrahamic faith. Yeah. How do you think about these larger questions? And does that come up in your dialogue? Because part of the Islamic world has always been in dialogue with the Jewish world and the Christian world, but it's also been in dialogue with the Hindu world for a very long time.
Totally.
And do these other faith traditions come up in your dialogue with folks in the Abrahamic traditions, and how do you approach that? Where because one of the places, if you were to do a Google search for the word Abrahamic, and maybe do like a Google News search, one of the common threads of the more pernicious forms of Hindu nationalism is the demonization of this Abrahamic heritage. And part of this is a lot of this is obfuscation for a lot of just explicitly anti-Muslim bigotry. in Hindu nationalism, and by Abrahamic they can group British colonialism along with the sort of issues they have with Islamic civilization. But do you think, I mean, because that's a risk you run when you start talking about you're trying to break down barriers on the one hand, but how do you avoid building up barriers in a new way when you're doing this dialogue? And how do you handle those other religious traditions in your work with folks in the Abrahamic faiths?
Great question.
Yeah.
So the Collins Center for Abrahamic Heritage is narrowly focused on the Abrahamic faiths. Mm-hmm. So we don't, to be honest, do a lot of work with the Eastern religions. Yeah. But as you pointed out, that these Abrahamic faiths are in contact with, Hinduism in particular, but also other Eastern faiths. And so it is relevant how we build relationships with people of those faiths. So, for example, at Acton University, which I mentioned, might be the most internationally diverse think tank conference in the world. We'll bring also some people of Eastern faiths. We'll regularly get some Hindu attendees, Buddhist attendees, Taoist attendees, and they can meet at the conference Muslim attendees, Christian attendees, Jewish attendees, and just the conversations that they have, you can see when they meet someone who has a different faith that maybe they had some presuppositions about, and the person treats them with respect, you can just see any possible prejudices that they had about this person just fade away. And that's a beautiful thing to see. So while we don't specifically do a lot of work in those areas, we do see the connections, and we think that our work can have more of a indirect benefit on the relations between people of Abrahamic faiths and those Eastern faiths.
So there are those sorts of challenges, but then there are also unique challenges of dialogue between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. While there's a lot of shared theological threads through these traditions, while there's a lot of shared civilizational experience, and while there's a lot of philosophical touchstones that are shared, there's also a long tradition of animosity, warfare, polemics, all of the sort of terrible things when people talk about, great wars of religion, when people talk about great religious persecutions. All of these faiths have been on various ends of all of these sorts of things throughout their history, often at each other's throats, in a very tragic way. And you have to deal with the fallout for that by, in trying to be a convener and trying to bring people of varying religious traditions together. You have to deal with those historical legacies, and you also have to deal with just basic misconceptions. Like a lot of folks brought up, in Islamic households, in Christian households, in Jewish households, like they don't necessarily have a lot of information, accurate information about folks who share a larger Abrahamic heritage. How do you work through that as a convener, trying to bring these folks together and in dialogue with each other? It's very challenging.
It is. It's almost built in our DNA to be suspicious of people who have different traditions from us. If you look back in human history, we can go all the way back to prehistoric times. About nearly 100% of men in prehistoric times would have been prepared for armed combat with other clans during their life. And about 25% of men were killed in violent combat in prehistoric times. It was a shocking number. Today, depends on the region, but there's some regions where it's still a very high percent, unfortunately. But if you average out throughout the world today, less than 1% of men are prepared for armed combat, and even fewer will die from violent combat. And then if you look at the rate of infectious disease deaths, massive chunk of people many years ago died from infectious disease, which were also often spread from in contact with people from other clans. And the life expectancy was around 30 years old. Today, it's over 70 years old. We live in a very fortunate time in history where a lot of trends are heading in a positive direction. But we have almost grounded in our DNA at this point this suspicion of other people, especially people who are from different places, don't share our beliefs, don't share all of our same history. So then you look at the traditions and the history of the Abrahamic faith, and as you pointed out, there's so much violence between Jews, Christians, and Muslims throughout our faith traditions, that has also grounded a lot of deep fear and mistrust between members of these faiths. And still today, there are unfortunately extremists in different faiths. And religious extremism remains a huge problem in the world today. It's something that the Collins Center partly exists to help present an alternative to religious extremism. So the challenges for dialogue, I think, are ultimately rooted in this innate fear of the other that people have. There's, I think, a fascinating story, a ring parable. I don't know if you've read Lessing's.
The Ring in the Book?
Yep.
Yes.
Nathan, the name of the play is Nathan the Wise. Isn't that a great name for a play? Just something about that, I don't know, just really resonates with me. Nathan the Wise. That's just great. But the story behind this ring parable, which is the centerpiece of his play, is that a man is given a ring that, if worn, will make him pleasing in the eyes of God and in guarantee of salvation. He bequeaths the ring to his favorite child, and that child bequeaths it to their favorite child. And eventually it's bequeathed to a man who has 3 children he loves equally. And so in the weakness of his heart, he decides to duplicate the ring, and he makes 2 exact replicas, and he does not tell his children who receives the real ring and who receives the fake ones. So now you have 3 children, each with a ring. They don't know which one's real. This is Lessing's attempt to explain the problem of dialogue when you have 3 faiths who all believe that they are the true faith and the other ones are inauthentic. But I think we can take Lessing's parable even further. Let's suppose those 3 children pass those rings on to their kids, and they tell them, this is the authentic ring. Your cousins have fake rings. And then this belief gets further grounded the more and more it goes. So I don't even think that fully captures just how complicated the challenges to interreligious dialogue are. Let's introduce 2 more magic rings to the picture here. So in Plato's Republic, he describes the ring of Gyges. And this is a ring that will turn the wearer invisible. And Plato uses this to discuss the concept of virtue. So there's, of course, the common expression that character is who you are when no one's watching. Jeremy Bentham proposed a panopticon prison system where every single member of the prison is constantly surveyed, because there's an idea that if you're being watched, you'll improve your behavior. So who we are when no one's watching, that's the idea that Plato gets at. So suppose that each of the 3 cousins with the Abrahamic ring gets now a ring that makes them invisible. And then let's throw, just to make this even crazier, let's throw in Tolkien's rings of power. Now each of them has a ring that gives them power to hurt each other, power to, say, make laws that treat each other unequally. Now we have a big mess. And I think what this gets at is we need not just awareness that there are people of other faiths who disagree with us and to respect those disagreements. Now, I think we are entitled to believe that we have the one true faith, and we can talk about that more because that's an essential point in interreligious dialogue. We don't want to water down differences between faiths. We don't want to say that we need to abandon our convictions. It's essential, I think, that people retain that right to believe they have the one true faith. But to have some religious literacy and acknowledge there's people who have different beliefs, of course, is essential. And then with the point about virtue, we need to be able to have the character and the respect and the love for each other to be able to treat each other with respect despite these deeply held differences. And then the point with the rings of power is we need a political system that distributes power because we know, well, Lord Acton, who you're an expert on, says power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we need a political system that has freedom, that allows power to be decentralized. And so we need religious awareness, virtue, and freedom. And that's Acton Institute's mission.
Mm-hmm. So as we look at all of these different religious traditions, one of the things that I always think about that's very important for this sort of work is each of these traditions have their own contributions, their own unique claims, their own unique contributions. How do we, because when you talk about that liberty being the key, one of those three keys of you need awareness, you need respect, and you need a sort of political structure that preserves religious liberty. Religious liberty has a mixed legacy in all three of those religious traditions. Lord Acton posits that religious liberty in Christianity begins with Christ's admonition to render unto Caesar what are Caesar and what is God's to God. But he also acknowledges that was never widely recognized in the Christian world for a very, very long time. And in fits and starts, and often, it gains traction in very marginal what is originally very marginal Christian sects, like Anabaptist tradition, Quakers, those folks. The majority report in most of the Christian world today is in favor of religious liberty. That hasn't always been the case. Yeah. In the Islamic world, there is again, there's been a minority report tradition in favor of religious liberty, but in many parts of the Islamic world, that is still very much a minority report. In those nations or in those particular sectarian traditions of Islam. Judaism also has a sort of complicated legacy here. Although for the vast majority of the Jewish people's history, they have been stateless. So it's less of it's a different sort of problem than it. I mean, the issue still exists, but the sort of like historical legacy is dealt with. Has to be dealt with in a different way because of the long periods of statelessness that the Jewish people endure throughout their history. Yeah. What are sort of some of those arguments for liberty in those various traditions that you've seen and like learned something from and come to find hope in that in each of these religious traditions there is some legitimate grounding within those very traditions themselves. This doesn't involve anybody having to turn their back on their religious tradition to embrace religious liberty, but that there are sources within all of these religious traditions that support a sort of robust understanding of religious liberty.
Yeah. As you pointed out, in some of these traditions, for periods of history, liberty was a minority view, or still is a minority view. And to really get a robust argument for liberty within these different faiths, I would direct you to some sources by Jews, Christians, and Muslims talking about their own faith. But I'm going to give you some categories of arguments that people could give from these faiths for liberty. Let's do it I'll give you 3 categories. The first category of argument would be that goals laid out within these different faiths are best achieved through the means of liberty. So let's start with the first Abrahamic faith, Judaism. What does Moses say to Pharaoh? Let my people go so that they may worship God. Let my people free so that they may worship God. So there's this idea of freedom that requires religious liberty. So religious liberty is grounded as a goal of Judaism. If you look at Christianity, there's a statement that we should look out for the least of these and treat them like we would treat Jesus. And there's a tradition of trying to empower the disempowered within Christianity, whether that be the poor, the sick, the homeless, the imprisoned. How do we lift up the people who most need our help? And there could be then an argument that liberty is the best means, both through free markets, but also equal rule of law and equal representation of human rights. Those are the best means to help these vulnerable populations. And then within Islam, there's a tradition called the Maqasid of the Sharia. So this refers to the intentions of the law. We talked about earlier the distinction between letter of the law and spirit of the law within Christianity. Well, this distinction exists within Islam as well. And there's this strong tradition that the laws, the political laws in the Quran may not have been for all places and all times exactly as they are spelled out for 7th century Arabia. But instead, we need to look at the goal or the intention behind the law. So a controversial law, for example, in the Quran, if someone steals, cut off their hand. Okay? Thinkers like Mustafa Akil and many others before him point to that and say, well, prisons did not exist in this context in 7th century Arabia. There was really no other way to stop this person from stealing other than this type of corporal punishment. So it was meant for this particular time, but it was not meant for all times and places afterwards. So in a society like ours today, where we have prisons, it would be more humane to throw that thief in prison, and there you achieve the same goal as that law. So I think on all 3 of those faiths, you can look at the goals, and then the best means to achieve those goals would be freedom. That would be the first category.
So this is a way of looking at taking very seriously political science and economics and social science and saying, listen, we've actually learned some things about how humans self-organize, how they govern themselves, and we can take a look at the goals that these religious traditions are seeking to attain, and we can use our reason to then come up with something that sociologists, economists, political scientists, in the modern world, they have empirical answers to these questions, and the religious traditions should appeal to them, as they appeal to reason in all sorts of other things, as they appeal to reason and evidence in everything else. So they should in terms of how to achieve these goals that they outline in their scriptures.
Yeah, excellent summary.
Yep.
So second category of arguments would be specific injunctions or precedents set in our respective faiths. Once again, you have to go to thinkers within these faiths to hear their own perspectives and get a deeper answer. But just to throw a few examples out.
Yeah.
In Judaism, the eighth commandment, thou shalt not steal, presupposes a right to private property. And there's other laws in the Torah that affirm the right to private property, which right off the bat then rules out communism among the viable economic systems. Within Christianity, you named one of the interesting quotes that render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, which implies the separation of church and state. There's also some fascinating conversations we could have about Christ's parables. Acton's co-founder Father Robert Sirico has a book that I helped with some editorial work on, the economics of the parables, that goes through several of Christ's parables and looks at some possible economic presuppositions. Like, so the parable of the talents, for example, presupposes that the economy is not a zero-sum game, but people can invest talents and then earn more off of that, and the economic pie can grow, not just remain stagnant. And then within Islam, so one of the verses that is quoted often by advocates for liberty within Islam is the verse, there is no compulsion in religion. That's a fascinating verse for those of us who are interested in classical liberalism. Classical liberalism being really founded on the idea that of the non-aggression principle, that coercion is a non-ideal way to get people to behave, but instead virtue needs to be uplifted as the means for a free and virtuous society. So no compulsion religion in particular in the Quranic context refers to people choosing what to believe. Unfortunately, what we see in the world today are, in some places like Pakistan, blasphemy laws and apostasy laws punishing, even through the death penalty, people for changing their faith. And there's this clear injunction in the Quran that says that people should be free to believe what they want to believe. There's no compulsion in religion. Of course, the extremists will debate the interpretation of that verse. But I think that is an interesting conversation to have.
So we go from the one. We have using the first way is we use sort of the rigors of science to think through, social science in this case, to think through the best way of realizing goals. In the second way, we take some of these specific injunctions and we reason general principles out of them.
Yeah.
The third.
Let's go. So the third is anthropology. This is something that listeners of Acton Line will have heard us talk about before. It's kind of one of the things that make Acton Institute unique. We focus on who the human person is. And our argument is that once you know certain facts about who human persons are, liberty should be the logical conclusion in how you treat them. So, for example, we talked about the Imago Dei, the idea that all people are created in God's image and therefore have universal human rights that should be respected. That idea grounds, I think, a great deal of liberty. We also know that we are corrupted by sin, and that means that power in the hands of any one person, any monarch, is likely to be misused.
Yeah.
So we should be decentralizing power. So those anthropological considerations, I think, can be grounded in all three of the Abrahamic faiths and also point us in the direction of liberty.
Okay. So we've got an anthropological, a social scientific, and a just general reasoning from the specific to the general. These are great frameworks to think through these questions. One of the things, those are things that we can all do in our own religious traditions. What is the unique sort of value proposition for someone to learn from other faith traditions?
Yeah.
What is it that, and you could answer this in a general way, or you could answer this in a personal way, because you've spent a lot of time thinking through different religious traditions than your own in your work with the Collins Center.
Yeah.
And what has been rewarding and enriching about that for you? And what do you and also what do you want to see the folks that, you know, as somebody who convenes, who brings these folks together, what do you hope that they get out of it beyond just a really rich engagement with their own theological traditions? What is it that you hope that they can learn from each other?
Love it. From my personal story,
Yeah.
I lost my Christian faith when I was in my early teens and first read the Quran, read lots of other holy scriptures from different faiths when I was in a period of searching for the truth. I later came back to a Christian faith. But I found reading those other documents enormously rewarding and expanded my view of what other people believe. I had kind of the attitude of, if millions or even billions of people believe that this scripture is the most important book in the world, how could I not want to see what's in that?
Yeah.
Even if I don't accept that religion as true, that really piques my curiosity. So I think living a good life, a large part of that is learning about the world around you. And if you never leave your pew and leave your Christian silo, as I mentioned earlier, you're missing out on a huge amount of knowledge about the world that I think is very enriching. So there's actually studies on the benefits of interreligious dialogue on participants. And they found things like people have increased confidence after engaging in interreligious dialogue. They have reduced fear. I think that's something that everyone would like to have. Obviously, they have an increase in knowledge about people different from them. And perhaps surprisingly, some of these studies have found that participants actually have more confidence in their faith rather than less after engaging in interreligious dialogue. A nugget we can throw out for parents here. A lot of parents try to isolate their children from hearing about other religious views or about atheism, for example, for fear that their children will be converted away from their faith. In psychology, there's a phrase called belief inoculation, where if someone is exposed to different viewpoints in small amounts, it actually strengthens, like a vaccine, it strengthens their faith rather than weakens it. So those are some empirically studied benefits of interreligious dialogue. And I'll throw in another one for you, which is I think interreligious dialogue cultivates the intellectual virtues. Intellectual virtues are things like, I'd say the chief one is intellectual humility, acknowledging that we are fallible individuals and We aren't the wise. I'm not the wisest or the smartest person in the world. There are people who are smarter than me and more knowledgeable than me who disagree with what I think. I think we, like I said earlier, are entitled to retain strong convictions that we have the one true faith. A lot of interfaith organizations go astray, I think, in trying to purport the idea that we all really believe the same thing or that we can't really know which faith is true. I totally disagree with that. But I do think that intellectual humility, which is compatible with strong convictions, is an enormous benefit of engaging with people who disagree.
So I was thinking in preparing for this interview years ago. I think this was probably a decade ago. This is before the Collins Center. But after I had gotten to know a fair number of Muslims through Acton's programming, I grew up with Jewish friends, Jewish relatives. I had a woman that she was in a small-sized Michigan city, and they were getting their first mosque in the city. And she expressed to me some concern about that. And I said, well, I'm like, you should go down and introduce yourself and just get to know these folks. And I said, if you'd like, it's never been easier in the history of the world to get very high quality resources. Introducing outsiders to different religious traditions, different scriptures of the world. This is something that, like, if the interest is there, and if you really want to engage, do it. Go out there, reach out there.
Amen.
And I'm really, really excited because that's really hard to do on your own. And this woman, after I said, you should go down there and introduce yourself, she thought about it and she goes, I see the wisdom in what you're saying, but that's really intimidating. Just on a level to just walk up to the mosque, knock, and just introduce yourself as a neighbor,
Totally.
and to talk and to say, hey, I don't know a lot about Islam. There's some things that I've heard that are upsetting to me. Can we talk about this? That's really tough to do as just a lone person. And when I look at what the Collins Center does, is it's a convener. It brings these folks together, and it makes it easier for folks to have that conversation. And
Totally.
I think it's an amazing thing that you guys do. We're really looking forward to those debates in the future. And if somebody listening is sort of like, you know what, Nathan really made the case. And you know what? Let's say they're a Muslim and they don't know much about Christianity, much about Judaism, or they're coming from similar from any other religious tradition. A Jewish listener who doesn't know much about Islam, doesn't know much about Christianity, would like to know more. A Christian. What sort of resources would the Collins Center recommend, or are there sort of some ongoing programs and initiatives that they could get involved in and reach out to you about getting involved in this sort of dialogue?
Absolutely. To the first part of that question, this sounds basic, but a shockingly high percent of believers have not read the Holy Scriptures of each other's faiths. So that's should be the first obvious first place to look. If Christian, Jew, Muslim wants to learn about a different faith, just read the foundational scripture for that faith. For the Collins Center, I encourage everyone to go to acton.org/Collins Center, COLLINS Center. And that will describe what some of our ongoing programs are. And through that, you can get on our newsletter, connected with our programs. And I would love to invite more people to our network. We are also 100% funded by donations. So if you agree that we're doing something unique here that the world needs, please consider partnering with us on our mission.
Absolutely. We will put those links all in the show notes. Nathan, thank you for being with us, and thank you for all your excellent work you're doing with the Collins Center.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's been a pleasure, and I love what you're doing with the video podcast.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.